All right, well, I think we'll dive in. Given that we're recording and folks will have registered and might be dropping in later or accessing the recording, let's get stuck in to workshop one of the three-part workshop series. So what we're going to do over the next three workshops is take the group through some of the key concepts that sit behind how do we do our version of bringing complex adaptive systems thinking to life in a hopefully pretty simple and accessible way. And then the hope stroke expectation is that between sessions, you'll all create a bit of space to do some thinking around the tools. So the coming together is a bit of common sense making and sharing and a bit of practice. Go away, do some thinking, come back, share what you've thought about in the start of the next session, learn the next bit of the framework, go away, bring it back, and so on, so that you start to really practice what we see in some ways as the most critical aspects of the framework, which are ensuring you've got a really good baseline conditions analysis that you can then keep up to date forevermore, using that as a lens to identify where you're going to prioritize your efforts around opportunity and risk, and then starting to think about what does that mean in terms of alignment to the values that I have, the values of my community, the values of my business, and often all of those three in combination. And then how does what we're going to focus on in terms of opportunity and risk generate value into the systems and networks that we're a part of. That's about the most we can do in a 3-workshop series. There's more work that can be done after that, but there's videos to access and other ways we might open that sort of stuff up. But that'll get us, I think, some really good thinking for folks around reality that you're playing into, where you want to focus, and what that might mean in terms of value that you can generate into the world. So what I wanted to do just to kick us off, just so the objectives across those 3 sessions are really around that conditions, opportunity, risk, values, and value generation, and then always pointing towards regional resilience. So part of that, and we'll get into the theoretical bits of it a bit in the value piece, but to be conscious of it now is always understanding that we operate in networks. And no one, no organization, no individual creates value in isolation. One of the simple examples we use, and I might raise it again in a couple of weeks, is if you think about just walking into the local sandwich shop and buying a sandwich, and you think about all the hands involved in getting to the point of being able to buy a sandwich, and it's obviously not just the person making the sandwich in the shop. If you go right back through the total supply network to the base sources for a sandwich, grains, vegetables, meats potentially, condiments, et cetera, there's an enormously complex value network that has to operate in a particular way to produce something as simple as a sandwich. So the more we think about the value networks that we're in, the more we're able to unlock the value that it's possible to generate, particularly looking into the future. So in terms of what that looks like today is relatively straightforward. A couple of quick reminders from the webinar. It's been a month. We're all in absolute information overload, so I just want to recenter us on some key points and also give some space. Folks will have had a chance to reflect, so any questions people might have. What's the basic theory, if you like, behind how we think about conditions? And then we'll work together to start baseline conditions analysis, and then I'll do a bit of a piece at the end just to connect as to how does this fit going into the next workshop. So in terms of some really quick reminders, remembering, of course, that when we talk about resilience, there's 2 bits to that. One is the traditional view of resilience, which is ability to recover from shock or adapt or to push through adversity. And then there's what we're looking for, which is the idea of change ahead of change. So creating a resilient future for ourselves. We draw on the science of resilience, but we're trying to think ahead of how the science works. So adaptation is okay when required. Recovery is critical, obviously, when necessary, but those are not preferred states. The preferred state is to be in a change ahead of change mindset. I also want to reinforce just a couple of things about disruption. Again, for us, this is any change in conditions that can limit or prohibit our ability to generate sustainable value. It's not just about, say, digital disruption, and it's not just about something like a pandemic. It's really seeing whole systems and whole systems implications. Let's not forget, we were already dealing with exponential change and likely exponential breakdown that was a bit masked and hadn't really come to the surface until we hit the pandemic, right? And the pandemic really exposed, particularly in this space here, as we went through that initial shock, it fractured for a lot of people their view, and a lot of systems were exposed very quickly: health systems, political systems, education systems, transport, manufacturing, you name it. There's been some level of exposure. And that what we're trying to do is build this bridge from our immediate reality, which we're seeing emerge as a COVID economy. And again, that's not just about the virus, it's about what's being revealed and what becomes possible as we learn to work in an environment dominated by COVID. But it's a bridge to what is coming next. And we've started to now, even just since we met a few weeks ago, we're starting to hear more and more language around the idea of a climate economy. And so what we're seeing as possible then is, how do you very consciously take your organization and your community through a COVID economy, leveraging that to set up really well for a climate economy. So back to my off-the-cuff comment at the start about the budget, I'm pretty sure that we weren't getting that sort of thinking as we're doing our budget forecasting. What does the COVID economy really mean? And how do we take our country forward into a climate economy? What's the right stuff to incentivize in the system to really set us up well for what's coming next? So that's the sort of thinking we want. Again, just to reinforce that the science behind that says that when you hit disruption, your performance drops off, and that some learning and some conscious practice about where we go next gives us the ability to recover beyond where we were. So this period in here becomes really critical. That COVID economy period we see is all about setting ourselves up well for what comes next. And we're seeing some indication that people are doing it, but in a lot of cases, it sounds like we're hanging on to business as usual until things go back to normal, with an acknowledgement that it won't ever be quite as it was, but it'll be pretty close. So we don't have to do too much more than hang on for a period of time. The real reinvention conversations don't seem to be happening at scale yet, but they're there. They're pockets of it for sure. And then a way of thinking about that is that sort of stabilize, transition, transform, understanding those are all interlinked and interwoven. But as you're thinking about conditions, opportunity, risk, and value generation, my view would be that it should ultimately be about how do we get onto this trajectory? Or in some cases, if there are bits of our old system that aren't going to stack up, how do we more gracefully let them go into decline and retire them, which is pretty important as well. And then just finally, a couple of last thoughts just to hook us back to that opening conversation. When we talk about leveraging disruption, that's about leverage in the physics sort of sense, right? So it's using disruption as a force to create momentum for the change that we want to see, so that we have some agency around change. A little reminder, and we're surrounded by reminders that it's not for everyone, and there'll be plenty of pushback and retreating to the past and hanging on to the old ways of doing things. And that's starting to surface maybe more palpably, particularly in the US context. There's the old managed adaptive decline. If we choose to hang on to the past, we really expose that risk. And then finally, it's what do we do consciously in that space, as I've said, that put us on that trajectory towards a resilient future. And then just to close us out quickly, and then we'll get into the conditions piece. We talked a bit about what we are starting to see drop away over here and what is starting to emerge in terms of what becomes possible. We'll get into this much more specifically through the conditions SOR pieces that we do together, but we really want to be thinking about, things like de-densification and what does that mean for regional communities? What capabilities are we going to need to really make that work in a powerful way, and so on. You got to deal with this in three headspaces all the time. That's part of the challenge. There's a personal piece, there's a me in whatever organization I'm in the role that I have, and then there's that organization or community as a whole. And we've got to have those multiple hats on at all times. which is part of why it's exhausting to deal with disruption, because you're not just dealing with it in isolation, particularly if you're open and awake to the whole system's view. So there's a bit of a reset required. We use the strategy and action framework as a way of doing that. Our assertion is that we all use this intuitively anyway, so it's just waking up the brain to practicing it in a more conscious way. The end game always is generation of sustainable value over time, which we find happens when you align what we see as the elements of the framework inside of conditions. And that's why we start with conditions analysis. What tends to happen is when you experience disruption, it's ultimately because something has fallen out of alignment with conditions. When I first learned this framework, which is, I don't know, nearly 15 years ago now, the thing I most like about it, and it is distinct from other frameworks and tools that I've used, is when something doesn't work, it's very easy to quickly interrogate through the framework where the breakdown was to reset, right? So it could be we didn't understand the conditions. Well, you'd update your view of conditions. It could be that we were focused on the wrong opportunities and risks. It could be that we didn't have the right capability. The value that we thought we were focused on isn't valued anymore because the conditions have changed. So you can very quickly go straight back into the thinking to reorient, to get to change very quickly. And that's by using the framework as a system. When we teach people and coach people, we do it in a linear fashion. Learn to do conditions analysis first, then look for SOR, then think about value, then think about capability, then think about what action you're going to take. The reality is it's a dynamic system. So at any one time, you're actually operating in all 5 of those spaces. So if you take an action, you might get immediate feedback, which tells you more about conditions. It might expose an opportunity or a risk that you didn't see before. So as you get more proficient in your practice of something like this, you start to operate in a whole systems way in all times. I often explain to people it's a bit like the difference between learning the steps in dancing and actually dancing when the music comes on, right? And eventually there's something that people go through from practicing the steps to being able to dance with the music, or a musician who learns the basics, scales and arpeggios and all that sort of stuff, but then eventually can get to a point where they can just play. They're not necessarily having to follow the structure that someone else has provided. So that's what this is ultimately about. It's a bit like learning to dance. And then finally, to get that sort of change ahead of change thing happening, it's about using the framework and cycling through it as often as is required based on the reality of the conditions that we're in. So if we're in really fast-moving disruption, particularly as we were, for example, in the very early stages of a global pandemic, every single day the conditions are changing. You just have to cycle through. What do I know better now today than I did yesterday about opportunity risk? What value is it possible to generate? What capabilities do I need? And you just do it. That's part of why we're exhausted, because I think a lot of people intuitively have been operating in a sort of strategy and action way, just not conscious to it and not playing it into what comes next, which is what we want to practice together. So that, again, was just to relocate us in the basics before we go into conditions. But any sort of comments, questions, reflections, insights, either coming out of the webinar a few weeks ago or just sort of hooking brains back into where we are now before we dive in a bit more deeply?
David, it's Elena here.
Yep.
One of the things you mentioned before starting to talk formally was the noise and the disruption that's happening in this sort of COVID economy at the moment. Is that something you'll be dealing with? Because that's something that's really easy to get caught up in.
The noisiness?
Yeah.
This, I think, in the early stages often sounds a bit self-referential, and it's not intended to. But what we find is the better, the more rigorous, let's say, that a conditions analysis is, the easier it is to start filtering through the noise. The more that you really understand the environment that you're operating in and what is emerging, the more the brain starts to make sense of what we call the themes and the patterns in all that noise. So it's a bit like this, when the reason we use driving as an example is there's a really complex set of conditions coming at us literally at whatever speed we're driving at, right? But because we've trained ourselves to drive, we make sense of the conditions that matter. And we separate the signal from the noise because we've practiced it. And we know that when we're